Good morning. Welcome to the Update the Zoning Code to Fill the Missing Middle of Housing webinar. My name is Sue Thering. I will be your host for today. I am joined by my colleague and friend, Brian Standing from the Dane County Department of Planning. Brian will be a guest speaker a little later this morning. And I have some thank yous and introductions here. The full lineup of speakers for the day is available on our website, designcoalitioninstitute.org, and you'll be able to see the lineup of speakers we have for today. We do have a 90-minute break around lunchtime, and we have some suggested readings that you might want to look at over the lunch break that was also sent to you all, along with the links to this program. This program is produced by Design Coalition Institute, which is a nonprofit organization centered in Madison, Wisconsin, in cooperation with the Wisconsin chapter of the American Planning Association. Thank you very much. And the University of Wisconsin Extension Housing Study Group. And many thanks to them for their participation in this. I will begin with a brief introduction for folks who are not familiar with the idea of missing middle of housing. Our viewers today come from all segments of any professions, disciplines, jobs related to housing. We have elected officials, we have professional planning people who work in municipal offices, we have nonprofit people, we have community organization people. So there is a spectrum of knowledge and understanding about the issues about missing middle housing. So I'll give some brief introduction, and as our speakers share their insights and experience during the day, I will occasionally jump in, and I have warned them of that, to help, to ask them to clarify any acronyms or any jargon specific to their profession, so that everybody listening will all understand what's going on. Okay, so zoning in the missing of middle of housing. What, how, and why? Zoning is not the only barrier to addressing our national crisis in the shortage of housing nationwide. It is only one, but it is an important one, and we will be focusing on zoning as the barrier today, but recognizing that there are a lot of issues having to do with national housing finance policies. The fact that the cost of housing is and has been increasing faster than wages, and the perennial barrier of NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard. People who live in neighborhoods and have grown accustomed to their neighborhood don't like to see change, and filling the missing middle of housing necessarily requires change in a neighborhood. So there's some background to idea of missing middle. How did it happen? There's a way to talk about it when we understand that government-driven housing tends to focuses on the most vulnerable members of our community, which is good. And the high-end market housing, which is investor-driven housing, focuses on reliable return on investment for those investors. In the middle of that is the missing middle of housing. Investor-driven housing primarily focuses on single-family detached houses that can be built dozens at a time in the suburbs, or high-end apartment buildings in urban areas. And everything in between we are now referring to as the missing middle of housing. And you see that logo there, Optico's design, and we need to give a lot of credit to that group who originally drew this diagram, which has been very helpful to planning and housing and people concerned with housing issues across the country. They coined the term based on an analysis of housing history and the term missing middle, and they drew this diagram to help illustrate the idea of missing middle. I borrowed their diagram, made a few updates of my own, but we need to give credit to that group. It has been, and it continues to be, extremely helpful as we discuss the housing shortage nationwide. Going up from the one end of that diagram to the next, accessory dwelling units. In that diagram, the red roofs are illustrative of the missing middle of housing. And accessory dwelling units are a way to help fill the missing middle, just adding accessory dwelling units, also known as ADUs, also known by all those other names, to existing single-family and duplex houses. That's one housing strategy to help fill the missing middle of housing. The other one is triplexes and fourplexes. And here we have some examples, some photos of historic triplexes and fourplexes, relatively new, modern looking triplexes and fourplexes. That's another type of housing that has been squeezed out in the last decades. Also, courtyard apartments. This is a traditional housing form, again, that has been squeezed out. And here are some examples of relatively older traditional styles and some more modern and current newly built courtyard apartments. And another housing form that has been traditional in different parts of the country but has been squeezed out over the last decades is cottage courts. And again, the examples, there's some relatively high-end cottages around a garden and some very small cottages around a very small courtyard. So there's a spectrum of ways to do cottage courts as a way to do missing middle housing. And next up the line, townhouses and row houses, higher density, more units per acre. Again, it's a very traditional form of housing that's been in the country for decades, but you have some examples of newer models and models that have been there for many years. The highest density is what we'd call multiplex, and this can be anything from an 8-plex, which two of those images that you can see now are 8 units, up to 20 units, or maybe a little more, would still be considered missing middle housing, as different from the 100, 200 unit apartment buildings that are increasingly in our urban areas. Also the live work, the traditional Main Street with the commercial on the ground floor and housing on the second or third floor. Again, there's traditional Main Streets, and here's a couple of examples of live work units that are also part of the missing middle. There's other types of housing, which is housing co-ops, which is really not a housing form. It's a form of ownership and living. They are traditionally in bigger, older buildings, and you can find them in almost any city. They're not a housing form. They're an agreement by people to live in a building and share a kitchen, often shared bathrooms. Sometimes they each resident owns a share in the ownership of the real estate of the building itself, and sometimes an organization owns the building and people rent out a room. There's different ways to do housing co-ops, but that does reach the needs of a segment of a population, and should not be overlooked as a possibility to help fill housing needs in our communities. Another form of housing that is also not a particular physical shape is co-housing, and that is different from housing co-ops because co-housing actually has individual full units, kitchens, bathrooms, bedrooms, living areas, usually smaller than the average unit because the people who join together and want to live in co-housing actually decide where they want to live and how they want to live before they buy a property or build a property or remodel a property. And that can be anything from single families, duplexes, multifamilies. There's all kinds of ways to do co-housing. And that is another one of the ways to help fill the missing middle of housing. So how did we get to this missing middle? How did this happen? It's a long history, and I'll go through it very briefly. It started when our cities were first platted. There were restrictive deeds, and that sign that you can see there actually was just taken down within the last few years about restrictive zoning. And you can see that flyer there was an advertisement for lots in a development, and their restrictive zoning covenants, deeds, essentially were not allowed to be sold to or leased to or rented to or occupied by any other than people of Caucasian race. This was typical of developing communities, cities, early on in the 1920s and before and after. However, in the 1940s, restrictive deeds and covenants were ruled illegal by the Supreme Court. And but by that time, most of the development in the areas were single-family, detached, owner-occupied homes. And then when in the 1930s, the United States government started a program to invest in home ownership, they went through all the cities, almost all the cities in the country, and graded the different neighborhoods based on what they believed were good investments. So that is the term redlining came into being. Anything that was graded D as hazardous was shaded in red, as you can see from this map, and no mortgages were allowed to be written in those areas. All the grade A green areas were allowed mortgages, home improvement loans, and whatnot. Over the years, those security maps, that's what they're called, every block in every city was evaluated by a real estate professional, and amongst the evaluation criteria included who were the occupants, what is the value, and as you can see from this slide, they wanted to know who the occupants were. In this particular case, they were laborers and ne'er-do-wells. That was the term they used, and they wanted to know how many foreign-born families were there and what percentage. In this case, they were Russian Jews, and they wanted to know if there were any Negroes. In this case, it said yes, and there was 65% of the population was Negro. And then is there an infiltration of such? And so there is, in this case, an infiltration of Russian Jews, and due to that and the various other conditions in that block, this particular block was given a grade of D and no housing mortgages or home improvement loans would be written in this block or nearby. This is just an example. This happened in every state or every city in the United States using that standard form. That form was standard throughout the country. From the 1940s to the present, the areas that were not redlined became the owner-occupied single-family neighborhoods that we know today. So the New York Times just printed a bunch of maps that color-coded a bunch of cities in the United States and color-coded exclusive single-family zoning in this color pink. I did not choose this color. And this is all the pink areas. This is the map of Charlotte, North Carolina. The pink areas is all exclusive single-family zoning. This is San Jose, California, as an example. This is Minneapolis, Minnesota, as an example. This is Portland, Oregon. Again, another example of exclusive single-family zoning. This is Chicago. This is Arlington, Texas. And these are some references. You folks have copies of this slideshow in your Google Doc that I sent you. You can look up these references at your leisure. And what we are going to go now, I am going to introduce our first guest speakers.